To support struggling students, and really all students during stretching and shrinking, it's helpful to identify the scaling piece by showing arrows from an original to its image. Usually right around the time that we're summarizing problem 2.1, students are starting to notice and use the language of scaling, but they haven't actually put a formal name to it. So that's when we'll introduce arrows that go from mug to zug and actually label a scale factor on those arrows. Another thing that will help support students is to be sure that there's a classroom public record available to the student to refer back to. So what I mean by a public record would be, for example, some chart paper where the thoughts of the class, the ideas that they've come to have been recorded.
We create a poster that can be hung on the wall and added to throughout the unit that identifies exactly what a shape needs to be a similar figure and what the classifications are of a similar figure. And with those anchor charts, whenever possible, we color coordinate different things. So maybe corresponding sides we will do in the same color, or if there's a table and a graph that go together, we will represent them in the same color so the students can visually see that connection.
So once the ideas have come out on those public records, as teachers we can record key vocabulary on sentence strip and actually stick those directly to the classroom anchor charts and public records so that students can see what the mathematical name is for this idea that they have discovered.
So we allow students to use calculators and multiplication charts when finding scale factor because we don't want their multiplication and fact knowledge to inhibit their mastery of the mathematical ideas. And we also use friendly numbers. So kind of per the child's education plan, if they struggle with math calculations, we will ensure that we're using whole numbers and focusing on easier numbers to multiply and find the scale factor of rather than starting with the fractional numbers and the numbers that aren't easily scaled up or down.
I find that students that are struggling, a lot of times they're struggling because they're more visual learners. And so whenever I can encourage them to draw a picture or to look at it in that way and then attach maybe whatever words or labels or numbers, they're really familiar with the clip art where if you do it in the corner it comes out and then it's proportional and ends up looking the same and it's bigger. And then I say, okay, have you ever messed with a friend's photo and just like shrunk it in like that or stretched it up just one way? And so I use that to talk about similarity quite a bit. And then I find them later on in the unit saying, okay, no, that's not going to make the right picture.
So during intervention and small group work time, we really work to refine the skills of graphing on a coordinate grid and multiplying coordinates and also identifying corresponding sides and angles.
When it's time for students to take measurements in stretching and shrinking so that they can compare an original and an image, it's important that you help your struggling students to be sure that the measurements are taken accurately, as that will affect the conclusions that they come to about the scaling. It's also helpful to provide students with clear overlays or tracing paper so that they can directly see what's happening when they go from the original to the image. Specifically, perimeter and area can be tricky, so if students have a visual to see how that transformation is occurring, it will make it easier for them to understand.
I know how important it is for kids to hold and physically be able to turn, rotate, slide things. And I also know that if they can find multiples of that shape, that you can physically touch them, squeeze them together as you're trying to do your different things. And kids really need a lot of time to muck around and manipulate those plastic pieces. I've tried it with paper before in years past, but when you use the paper, you have two issues. One is you got to get somebody to cut them out. And if we cut them out during class, it's going to take a lot of time to cut out those pieces. So there could be human error involved there. And then the bigger pieces, just the physical things are so much easier to manipulate.
Some students have a lot of difficulty with scale factors that involve decimals and fractions. So allowing them to draw their shapes on graph paper in which they can count the squares and really compare the two different shapes, and also giving them different transparencies that they can put the two shapes right on top of each other to compare directly right in front of them.
It can be a lot for struggling students to have to graph all of the characters that are presented in problem 2.1. So oftentimes we'll have struggling students just focus on mug, zug, and lug. They're still going to get the idea of which WUMPs are family members and which ones are imposters. They'll get the big idea of the lesson, but they won't have as much work to do. Struggling students might have difficulty with the lab sheets that are provided for graphing the WUMPs. So if they struggle and need a larger grid, you can look in your provided lab sheets, and there's an enlarged grid just for quadrant 1 where students can graph the different characters in a way that's more manageable for them on a larger grid. Also, when you look at the table that students have to complete for 2.1 with all of the rules for the WUMPs, it can be very daunting to try to pick out the coordinates that need to be graphed. So teachers can assist students by either covering up or folding over the table so that students aren't looking at everything and only see the column of coordinates that they're graphing at that moment.
I really strongly suggest that you use the grid paper that is the larger grid. I would not use the smaller grids where we have 4 different hats on one sheet of paper. Another thing that I think is very wise is to not use front and back, because you want these kids to be able to see all these hats at once. Well, you know, as they're creating them, they want them sitting out on the table so they can be looking at the rule, the picture of the hat, and being able to look at all the other hats that they've drawn.
Peer editing is a strategy you could use where kids are actually creating a response, a free response. So all of those problems that are explain your answer, those kinds of questions could be used in peer editing. And the students would do their assignment, they would complete their assignment, and they give it to a peer for feedback, kind of like what they do in their English classes. So they're getting some feedback and a chance to go back and make mistakes. So if they have some grammatical errors or some spelling errors as they're learning their new language, someone else can help them fix those. And in investigation 2, they will be graphing the WUMPs and having somebody go back and check their work to make sure that their images look like somebody else's. That's a non-language based peer editing strategy that you could use.